Hey everybody, welcome back to the Optometry Money Podcast, where we're helping ODs all over the country make better and better decisions around their money, their careers, and their practices. I am your host, Evon Mendrin, certified financial planner and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors, an independent financial planning firm just for optometrists nationwide. And on today's episode, I take a short break from our taxes series and welcome a really great guest to the show, Amanda Collaso, owner of Bookkeeping for Optometry. And we talk all about how to think of the return on investment for different investments in your practice. We talk about equipment purchases, specialties, investments in staff and associate doctors. It was a lot of fun, and Amanda is someone that knows optometry so well from her experience working in practices and now owning a bookkeeping business for optometry practices. And she brings so much to this conversation. And I also want to bring up a few updates to my firm as well. Due to popular demand, I'm excited to announce that my firm is now offering standalone student loan planning for optometrists. Many have asked for something like this, not being quite ready for a full-time advisor yet, but still wanting someone to help evaluate and put a plan together just to tackle student loans. So I'm now offering that as a standalone service alongside my main ongoing service model and also hourly consulting as well. Also, if you're a member of the ODs on Facebook community, I just wrote a newsletter article for their monthly wealth advisor newsletter, all about how to track progress towards financial independence. So check out their website, www.odsonfb.com, as in ODs on Facebook, to check it out and sign up for their newsletter. It's always good stuff each and every month, and there's a lot of clinical stuff there as well. If you have any questions on today's show, feel free to reach out and send an email to Evon, E-V-O-N, at optometrywealth.com. Check out all the resources in the show notes, which you can find on the Education Hub on my website, optometrywealth.com. And while you're there, check out all the other articles and episodes we've done. And you can also schedule a no-commitment introductory call to talk about what's on your mind financially and learn about how we help ODs navigate financial decisions nationwide. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Amanda Collaso. And welcome back to the Optometry Money Podcast. I hope you're doing great, and I am excited to welcome to the podcast on this episode Amanda Collaso with Bookkeeping for Optometry. Amanda, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course, and I'm excited to chat with you about something that I think is important for every practice owner to at least grasp a concept, and that is thinking through and calculating out the return on investment for practice investments. Because inevitably, every practice owner is going to think about, well, how do they use their cash flow? And at the top of that list for me, it should be, well, what does the practice need? How do they need to reinvest into the practice in order to increase patient capacity, to improve productivity and efficiency, or whatever else it may be. So I'm excited to dive into how you think about the return on investment on a whole bunch of different categories of things that a practice owner can invest in the practice. But before we dive into all that fun stuff, I just want to get your background a little bit. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your business, what eventually led to you starting your business.
Yeah. So my background's a little mixed, but I would say foundationally, it's been always in optometry. So 14 years in optometry, wearing different hats, teching. I did some billing and coding and a lot of administrative work. I worked for a really business-minded doctor who taught me a lot about, obviously, optometry from a teching perspective and billing, but just overall, like running his business. He was very motivated, opened a bunch of different practices. And so it's kind of exciting watching all of that unfold. And then other than that, I've done bookkeeping for small businesses throughout the years. My husband and I owned a business that we sold. So when I decided to start my own firm, I was like, who do I want to serve? At first I was fine with anyone. And then I realized, that's not the best way to spend my time. helping a broad group of people. I really wanted to help someone specifically. And then obviously I went to optometry. I was like, these are my people. They speak my language. 14 years. I kind of think that they're underserved as well. It's not like you hear a lot of, niche financial institutions that are just aimed at optometry. I mean, there's us, of course, but it's becoming a thing. But yeah. I think it's really important to, kind of know the business and have someone that you trust with your finances know more than just the bookkeeping part, right?
Yeah, I like that. I think you and I can relate in a lot of different ways. I think a lot of the ways you described why you served optometry and why you went that direction with your business could have came right out of my mouth. So I think that's pretty cool. And so let's talk a little bit about, I mean, you have experience inside of practices. You've seen the inner workings. You've probably seen firsthand a lot of these conversations and decisions. So let's start with, how should a practice owner think about the return on investment of an equipment purchase or an instrument purchase? And when I see this, it's usually from the tax perspective, because it's usually the end of the year and a practice owner's looking at their estimated tax, or their tax person said, hey, if you want to lower your tax bill, you should probably purchase an equipment in the practice. And so it's usually, for me, for my conversations, it's a lot of times the tax side that's driving that decision. But I think it should be flipped. I think that should be the last thing to decide on, how to handle the taxes. And in the beginning should be, well, does your practice actually need it? So how would you look at that decision? If someone's thinking about, okay, I want to or feel like I need to purchase some piece of equipment, 4-opter, OCT, whatever it may be, like how should they think about the return that their practice is going to get from that?
Yeah, I mean, so breaking even, there's an actual, mathematical equation. If you look at it, it's a very straightforward thing. You take your fixed costs, you divide it by, how much you're going to sell the product or service for, take out, subtract the variable costs, and that's kind of your answer. But it's not always that simple, in my opinion. So you can look at something like retinal imaging. Most offices have retinal imaging now. Maybe it's about time to upgrade your retinal imaging. Maybe it's time to get it at all if that's not, where you've headed in the last few years and you're kind of wanting to update some technology. So if you break it down, say you're looking at a retinal camera, $60,000. And let's say you, on average, can get $40 a patient, between insurance and out of pocket. And you take that and subtract, $10, we'll just say for even numbers, variable costs. So you're going to get, you have to sell 2,000 retinal images or, perform 2,000 retinal images on patients in order to break even. But what does that look like in your practice? Is that something that is reasonable? We kind of want to sit in like a 6 months to an 18-month range of breaking even, especially with something like a piece of equipment. I would lean closer to 6 months to a year. So breaking that down, you have 2,000, retinal images you need to sell. You have 20 patients a day. About 80% of those say yes. That's a high percentage, but it could happen. So 16 patients a day, you're open 5 days a week, break it down. That ends up being about 6 months worth of your time. Even further than that, you can look at, 6 months is a great breaking even point, right? It's ideal. It's on the low end of expectation, to be honest. And so if you're looking at that and wanting to know what that looks like, because of the way leasing and purchasing of equipment works in optometry, it's oftentimes like all the interest is included, or interest is already prorated throughout, and it's just kind of what it is. So you say you have a 3-year lease. Is it worth spending that extra roughly, $9,000 to $10,000 on revenue on paying that off in 6 months? Or do you have other places you could spend that extra income that you're getting for that investment? So you can look at it that way. That's a really great example and a pretty straightforward one that anybody could really understand or relate to.
Yeah. And when you say break even, so that the revenue you're generating from that piece of equipment is greater than the cost of that you have to incur to run it, to use
Yeah,
it.
yeah. Including costs of, staff costs and things like that. All of that is factored in. Yeah.
And then revenue, I guess you're factoring in, okay, how many exams can you use this piece of equipment on?
Yeah.
How much do you expect to get in revenue per exam? So that's sort of your revenue that you're sort of calculating. Okay, how many patients do I think will use this equipment, that we can use this equipment with, and then how much do we expect to get per encounter? Right, that's sort of that revenue side. And then what are some costs that you might want to look at coming in when purchasing equipment? Some that are obvious and some maybe that practice owners may not have thought of.
Yeah, depending on what you're choosing, if you're upgrading something, you have to consider time to install. So you maybe close down for a whole day, time to train staff on a new piece of equipment. Like, the example I use, retinal imaging is fairly simple. Most cameras are user friendly, but if you think about an OCT, not always the case. If you're looking at, an iLux for dry eye, you may need to train your doctor. I've seen offices that take 3 or 4 days of training just for that. So is that worth your time? Is it worth that amount of money that you're spending paying staff to be there when there's no patients coming in, most likely? So, and then just overall space, like the actual real estate it's taking up in your office, is that worth it? If you're thinking about, another example is, for instance, what if you were to get an OCT? Those end up sometimes being lower costing than the example I used, and you can actually get more revenue about it or with it. But if you are not a office that's seeing many, people that are at risk for age-related macular degeneration or something like diabetic retinopathy, is that worth your space and time? Some of these machines are huge and you may have limited space. So once again, another consideration of training, because that's not something everyone knows. Yeah. So those are the biggest costs. I would say staff is the biggest, and time off, time to slow down your lanes so that you can install and train.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting, you're thinking about space in the office too, because I'm thinking of, okay, just like revenue and staff time, like that all makes sense to me. You want to make sure that the cash makes sense, but you also have to think about, okay, can I use that space differently in some other way? And does it make sense to take up, because every optometry office is sort of constrained by their office, right? It's how much square feet do you have? How much patient service can you squeeze within that amount of square feet? So that's interesting. And then of course there's like you mentioned, the hard cost of actually having to purchase or finance it. And if you're financing, interest involved. What about maintenance? Is there maintenance that's involved that needs to be taken into account?
Yeah, so oftentimes it depends on, the way you are leasing or purchasing your equipment. A lot of times, maintenance and IT help comes with it. But that also, once again, takes time out. If your connection from your retinal imaging machine broke to the computer, that means that you're out 3 days of that. That's 16 patients a day times 3. So you have to consider those things. It's not necessarily an out-of-pocket cost as far as maintenance goes directly, but it can affect your bottom line in a different way. If that makes sense.
Is something I've read about recently, and I thought I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Is there times where you need to think about an additional marketing expense too? And maybe where I'm thinking about that is like if there is a new service you're not providing, or a new test you're not providing, or a new specialty, which I'll ask about a little bit too. Is there an additional marketing cost that you have to think about if you're needing to market that new patient experience?
Yeah, I believe that, it can be common expectation to get a new piece of equipment and utilize it, and then instantly becomes a revenue generator. But if you've only been doing comprehensive exams for 10 years, no one's really seeking you out for dry eye therapy, or no one's thinking, oh, I have, diabetes. I know I can come to this office for that specific service. So yeah, I think that dedicating specific marketing towards what that instrument is for is really helpful. And it really is another cost, yes, to consider in purchasing something. Now, for instance, I'll go back to a retinal camera always. It's kind of a standard thing. It's kind of standard. It's not really anything above and beyond anymore. They do get, technology changes and there's always a new one coming out. So we don't need shiny object syndrome, but yeah, it's pretty standard. So it's not the same with that, but yes, something more specific like dry eye therapy is the first thing that comes to my mind. Yeah. You have to kind of put yourself out there. If you're, wanting to get a Ortho-K fit set, are you, advertising that you do that? Do people even know? Do they know what to ask for? Do they know what that is? That's kind of thing.
Yeah. I wonder, is there sometimes where that return can't really be like mathematically calculated well, but it's just a part of, like, you just have to do this as a part of the patient experience, like a manual phoropter versus a digital phoropter. Like, are there things that you just need to update and upgrade in the practice? Not really because it's going to drive revenue and profit, but because it's just a part of sprucing up and updating the practice and keeping appearances. Like, have you seen that as well? Like, how should a practice owner think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's twofold. It creates efficiency in your practice. If you have a, automatic phoropter, that's efficient. That is a lot less, flipping of lenses and things like that. It also makes an impression upon patients.
Yeah.
If you're really, especially if your demographic is between 20 and 40, I personally, as a consumer, want to go in and see their latest technology. I want to schedule online. So all of those things that may be costs of software, maybe costs of actual equipment, do make a difference. And it's not quantifiable necessarily, but it is makes an impact. Yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of increasing your brand or your goodwill in your practice. And I guess you can't really project that out predictably. I guess you can look backwards and say, well, did my revenue increase? Did I sell more of any particular product? I guess you can look backwards and see, but it's not really something you can predict reliably. You just kind of have to go with a feeling that this is what's best for the patients, best for the practice.
Yeah.
And some of these costs are going to be fixed. Some of these costs are going to be variable. Can you talk to us about some of the differences between the fixed and variable costs when purchasing equipment?
Yeah, the biggest difference is, so it depends on how you're looking at it. Fixed costs, if you're looking specifically at equipment, is just the simple cost of the equipment. If you're looking at, a cold start, you're looking at the whole, how much is this going to cost overall to open, and how many patients do I project to see? It's a huge part of a business plan when you're looking at a cold start, So if you're looking at a piece of equipment, once again, variable costs, it's the cost of staff, the cost of training. That ends up being on the lower end. If you're looking something like, I want to invest my, money into a new frame line, that's different. That's the cost of lab costs, lens costs, and then staff cost on top of that. So it just kind of depends. The variable costs change, depending on how much you're producing, how often you're using said product or service, things like that. So.
Yeah. Something you've posted about on LinkedIn, and if you're not following Amanda on LinkedIn, please go find her and follow her. But you've posted about this specific metric called contribution margin. This is a really handy metric for any practice owner to use in the practice, especially when looking at equipment purchases. You calculate contribution margin by taking the revenue collected and then subtracting out any variable costs to generate that revenue. So cost of goods sold, maybe production-based doctor wages. And we talked about new income that you're going to generate from the equipment, but you can't forget about those variable costs. So what's left after you subtract your variable costs out of the revenue, that's your contribution margin. It's the amount of revenue, or really the percentage of revenue that's left over to put towards all the other fixed costs in the practice, your lease, your staff wages, marketing, etc. So after subtracting out variable costs, how much of that revenue is left to tackle fixed costs? And where this is helpful for equipment is that Buying it may increase fixed costs like we talked about earlier. You're going to have a loan payment, potentially additional staff, maintenance. If you know that the variable costs eat up 60% of the revenue that you're going to generate from this new piece of equipment, that means that 40% is your contribution margin. That 40% is what's left of that revenue to cover the new fixed expenses that you generated from buying it. And that's just to break even before covering the other expenses and then eventually to your profit. So if you make $100, only $40 goes to the new payment and staff to operate it. So you can use this formula to calculate your break even too, which ties into everything you explained earlier. How much revenue do you need to generate to cover your variable expenses and then be able to take care of the new fixed expenses? After that, it goes to your other practice expenses and then down to profit. So this is something that you can sort of use to back into that break even number of exams or number of whatever it may be.
And I guess another way to look at all this is literally just like the return on investment calculation. Like what is the return, the net income you're getting over its lifespan or yearly, and divide that by the initial amount you paid into it. And is there a return on this? I think I feel like both of those are important because they tell you something different. The break even is so important because it tells you, are you going to generate cash from it? Are you actually going to break even at some point from a cash point? But then the return calculation will tell you, okay, are you actually getting a return from it over its useful lifetime?
Yeah. And is it enough of a return to make it worth your time?
Yes. The time and the hassle and just anything else you can do with that money.
Yeah.
I guess when you put it in that perspective, like a return on investment and what is that, and calculate it, then you can really compare it then. Like I can do XYZ with these dollars. What is the best use of my time and hassle and what will provide the best return on investment?
Yeah.
So let's move on. That's equipment. What about adding a specialty or adding a totally new specialty? Maybe like you said, you're used to doing comprehensive exams. Maybe you want to add, you're interested in dry eye, myopia, whatever it may be. Like, how do you look at the return on investment when thinking about adding a new line of service like that, a specialty?
Yeah. Those are buzzwords right now, right? Dry eye therapy and myopia management. But it's for a reason. They're very important. I live in Colorado, so I understand the need for dry eye therapy. But if you're looking at it holistically, you're buying equipment. That is a consideration that you need to make. If you are looking at, once again, training for staff, marketing, like we said, I don't think that going about it saying, oh yeah, we do comprehensive exams. Oh, and we do dry eye, kind of throwing it in as an afterthought. It has to be very specified, very targeted in marketing, which, I feel like a lot of optometrists don't spend a ton of money in marketing. So there could be a lot of room there to utilize marketing as a good tool to, increase revenue with a new specialty. So and like I said, another thing is just, I always go back to staff and training, probably because that's what I know. But yeah, how long are you going to be closed down? How long are your lanes going to be closed to teach this? And do you have the demographic for it? Is that a patient base that even cares about that? So it depends. Like if you're in a, low socioeconomic neighborhood, are you going to want to focus on dry eye? Probably not. Overall costs of doing anything specialty wise is just definitely make sure you're investing in marketing. Definitely make sure that you're taking that time in consideration of how much time it's going to take to train staff. You may not be comfortable, or you may want to hire a new OD that's specific to, myopia management. Maybe that's what you want them to do. So there's another, cost involved, is a new associate doctor or a new staff member to help, things like that.
And going back to that cost, there's the time, like you mentioned, the time for training and all of that. How much revenue are you giving up to go through that? But like you said, you then probably have to purchase equipment if your practice isn't already equipped for that. You may have to hire another associate optometrist who may have that sort of skill or specialty. What additional staff time is needed? Do you have to hire another team member in order to handle additional patient flow? There's all these sort of things. And I guess you think about it the same way as the equipment. You think about, okay, how many patients do I expect to use? Or how many patients do I expect to bring in and take on this service? How much additional revenue can I get from those interactions? And then minus all the costs, and am I ever going to break even? And what is the return on that time and cost? What is the return on that investment? It's sort of that equipment decision, but just with more costs and potentially higher income.
Yeah. I mean, looking at the contribution margin and making sure there's no like pain in the butt tax that you have to pay just to deal with this to get to this point. Like,
and that's a technical term, right?
Right. Yes, exactly.
Yes, right.
But yeah, I mean, it's true. Like, do you want to spend the time and money? And sometimes I find a lot of optometrists are spreading themselves super thin, like shiny object syndrome, like I said. Oh, myopia management. Oh, dry eye. Like, it has to be a very focused thing. Don't just bring an iLux in because someone showed it to you at, one of the conventions, and then now you want to do it. But then what is your goal after that? How is that going to help provide better care for your patients? How is that going to provide more revenue for your business? How is that going to make your life easier and better, and your patients' life experience in your office easier and more robust? You know?
I feel like it goes back to what you said earlier. Maybe all of these decisions do, equipment, specialties, whatever it may be, is who are your patients? Who is your target demographic? Who are you wanting to serve? And does any of this stuff like actually serve
Makes
them
sense.
well? Yeah. Does any of it serve it? Are they going to want it? Are they going to pay for it? Does it even make sense for them at all? Maybe everything starts there, right? Is who are you targeting? Does this improve your service for them? Are they willing to use that service at all or not?
Yeah. I think about specifically like an OCT in that situation. Are we, like I said, are you in the right demographic? I can't sell an OCT to a 22-year-old college student. That's not going to be their concern. They're there to get glasses, but they may be interested in dry eye therapy because that is actually something among the general populace is being talked about more and more, and the benefits. I feel like I see it all of the time now. So is it worth that? And how long will it take you to get there? You may be buying a cheaper piece of equipment. You may be being able to charge a higher rate for said service. But if you're seeing 5 patients a week that are wanting an OCT, why is that? That's not worth your time. It's not worth your, space in your, like I said, in your pre-testing room. And you have to kind of look at that before you choose to purchase something. You want to look at how many times am I even, referring out for an OCT? How many, patients do I see over the age of 50? Is my demographic patients with children that aren't really interested? Now, an OCT, as we know in the profession, it's beneficial for everyone. It'd be kind of nice to do it across the board, but not everybody sees the value.
So is that sort of like an internal barometer or sort of like a flag for a practice owner or for an optometrist just to say like how many patients are we referring out to someone else for XYZ? Like, do you feel like that's sort of a good starting point to say, like maybe there's something here, maybe I should think about opening up this service to those patients? Like or is it mostly about interest, fascination? Like where do you feel is sort of the starting point to thinking about, okay, should I start to bring on a specialty into the practice? And if so, which one?
Yeah, I think referrals are a great metric to decide, it's definitely quantifiable. Like I sent 5 to the, ophthalmologist down the street, but I could have just done an OCT in office or something. Kind of listening to your patients and overall taking in, like I said, I'm in Colorado. Dry eye is huge here because it is dry here. So listening to your patients and their common complaints, do you hear over and over again about how much it would be helpful to not deal with these things, how much they're using eye drops and they don't want to all the time? Kind of listening and paying attention to your patients, as well as quantifying, referrals going out, quantifying, I can't, being frustrated, like I can't help them more and I wish I could, but making sure that helps across the board, not just, your handful of your favorite patients that may necessarily need that and not someone else.
Yeah. And I guess that gives you a reasonable basis for doing the calculation in the first place, because every projection's uncertain, right? Nothing is set in stone. You can make it as rosy as you want. You can make it as awful, worst case scenario as you want. But at least if you kind of know, okay, I've had this many conversations with people, or I've referred this many patients because I wasn't able to do this before. I guess that gives you sort of a reasonable basis to start that calculation. Say, okay, here's my reasonable amount of patients I may see. And then you can start from there rather than just guessing, right? Maybe that's a good place to start.
And the good way to know that is to know your numbers, to make sure you're checking in, make sure you know how many patients you're seeing, kind of looking at those metrics and making sure that I feel like it's very easy as an optometrist in a practice to kind of look at baseline and that's it, or look at their EMR and like, oh, I made, 50,000 this month. But is that, who is that going to? Who are you serving the most? Yeah, kind of paying attention. And it's hard when you're an optometrist and you're in your exam room all of the time and you're focusing on patient care only. You don't really get that idea. You don't really know as much what's going on in the front, which is just as important as what goes on in the exam room. So I feel like that's another good way. That's another good thing to look at is hiring new staff. How do you break even on new staff too,
And let's transition now, something you just brought up. How do you measure the return on your staff? Because we talked about equipment, we talked about services, now we're talking about human beings, which is maybe a little bit weird to say, but like your team is an investment in the practice, and by far one of at least the top two valuable investments. I guess we won't say costly, but valuable investments in the practice. So how do you look at measuring, okay, if I'm going to hire someone, or if you've already hired staff, like how do you measure the return on those dollars put to staff compensation?
Yeah, you definitely have to take all things into consideration. Obviously, wages, taxes, benefits, things like that. For me in bookkeeping, I really try to separate out staff fees so that you can see how much am I paying towards scrubs, how much am I paying towards continued education, and then obviously wages and taxes and things like that. So having that idea and having a goal in mind of, and the idea of mind that about 6 months is when your staff member becomes fully self-sufficient, fully worth the investment,
6 months before up to speed, basically, like fully functioning.
Yeah, I would say that's the goal. Obviously you can train someone and have them, doing teching on a person in a week, but really to be efficient, to learn the processes in your business. And then, like I said, reaching that break-even point with that staff member, because it does cost a lot of money to hire. It's not easy, as well as an OD. Like, are you looking at the cost of their continued education? Another thing that I would break out when it comes to bookkeeping is OD versus non-OD wages, so that you can see, am I, yes, I want to take more vacations. I'm going to add another, associate doctor. But are they bringing in enough revenue? Are they, is your turnover really quick? So if you're putting, $1,000 worth of money towards training and all of these things, and then they leave in 6 months, you're just hitting that break-even point, and you kind of want to reassess, what your goals are with staff and training and things like that. But yeah, I think that it is a quantifiable number, but it's not like you can look at it overall and say, this is my burden rate to have an employee. This is how much it costs for them to have their own email address. This is how much it costs to, like I said, scrubs, train them, how much time it's taking from your other staff to train, things like that. And it's quantifiable, but it is human beings. It has to be, you also have to look at how much value are they bringing to your practice? How many people, want to come and see that smiling face or what have you?
Yeah.
How, once again, with this doctors, how much, specialty revenue you could bring in if you bring in someone that is awesome at ortho K or something.
And what are some decision points in the practice where an owner might look around and say, okay, maybe I need to add on an additional staff member, and not an OD staff, not an OD, an optometrist, an associate optometrist, but just another staff member? What are some decision points where they might look around and say, okay, maybe it's time to increase my staff?
Yeah, I mean, a good way to just know that is to talk with your staff, see where they're at, see where, if you're noticing that you have two people at the front desk and there's the, preliminary room is empty because they're on the phone and one's scheduling, you kind of have to focus. And that's another thing, making sure that you are working on your business, not just in your business, not just in patient care, but making sure that staff is, knows what to do and they're following procedures, making sure that you have that organization to make everybody efficient. And then if you're doing all of those things and you still notice, oh, that patient's been there an extra 10 minutes, what is going on there? And overall, looking at your wages versus your revenue, you have to look at it holistically, make sure that patients are being taken care of, everything's running smoothly. It's, not a quantifiable, not necessarily quantifiable. I mean, you can look at it like, if I have 20 patients a day, I definitely need 3 staff members. But that's not always the case,
Yeah. I like what you said, like until you pull yourself out of the exam room and like actually observe and talk to your team and like seeing what's going on, you're not really going to notice a lot of these things. And I guess there's a lot of different indicators. There's, okay, are patients waiting a lot? Is your team burned out? Like, are they feeling the pressure and just not saying anything? I guess there's a lot of indicators to say, okay, you've reached capacity, right? Because that's ultimately the thing that is going to, I feel like that's the thing that's going to want you to hire next, is capacity, is you are reaching a point where you can't take on additional patients, which if we tie back to numbers, that means you're bottling you're capping your revenue. It means you're capping your profitability. So until you pull yourself out of that exam room and start to look around and take on that management and leadership role, you're not really going to notice a lot of these things. Unless your team is really talking to you openly, or your office manager.
Yeah.
And some things I've seen about like staff efficiency, Dr. Jerry Hayes, I've seen him write about, if you have, your practice should produce per full-time employee, revenue per full-time employee, like between 125 and 175. So I guess there's like numerical benchmarks or, guardrails. I guess that's the thing I'm thinking about, like guardrails to figure out, okay, is my revenue per full-time employee at a place where I'm either understaffed, overstaffed? What is that? But there's all that qualitative stuff, like you mentioned, that you really don't know until you ask around and talk to your team and look around.
Yeah, exactly. And hitting capacity is important as far as staff goes, as far as space goes, like I said before, as far as how many lanes you need. It's all kind of overall looking at maxing out, because you don't want to hit a wall. If you're having patients and they're breaking down the doors and they want to come in and they're, you're having to put them out 3 weeks because you have one lane. You really want to make sure you're evaluating those things annually, quarterly, looking at your numbers, making sure, like I said, you may not necessarily feel like it reflects the need for an additional staff person, but maybe having that additional staff person could create more revenue in itself. You don't necessarily view them as revenue makers in the sense that, doctors are the direct, provider of revenues when it comes to services. But if you have more, people making cold pre-appointment calls and things like that, that in itself is going to be really beneficial.
Do you, and this might be an episode in itself, but do do you see that there's anything different about the metrics telling you to hire another associate and how you should look on the return of adding an associate? Like how do you think about that? And how is that different from other staff costs and return on other compensation?
Yeah. I think that when you're thinking about hiring a new associate OD, looking at obvious things. What do my books look like? Does this make sense? And honestly, I go back to waiting time. If my patients are waiting 20 minutes, think about how much that stacks on top of each other. Think about how much you are missing out in that time. But once again, you have to think, am I going to break even within 6 months to a year? Because, of course, hiring an OD is going to be a lot more expensive than hiring a staff member.
Yeah.
You have to take into consideration, are you paying for their, continuing education? Are you paying for their dues and fees? Yeah, you want to just make sure that it makes sense and you want to take yourself, but you also want to take yourself out. You don't want to limit yourself and say, well, I don't feel like I'm ready for that. I don't think I make enough for that. But maybe you could, if you took yourself enough out of your exam room and found ways to increase revenue other ways.
Yeah. I think something that's interesting is that sometimes the owners, especially if you're a single doctor practice, sometimes the owners can be the bottleneck in the practice.
Yeah.
Which is sort of hard for anyone to, think about and admit. But, sometimes you are the bottleneck, and sometimes you do need to remove yourself from the equation, bring on an associate, and allow yourself to do other things that are maybe more meaningful to the practice growth. Sometimes you need to think about that. And something that's interesting too is that adding an associate, okay, we can imagine that if you add an associate, that means you have more capacity to see more patients on sort of like, these are direct things that are impacting revenue. But you also can't overinvest in an associate if there's not enough staff to handle that capacity. So there's sort of like chicken and egg. Like you got to figure out the balance between the whole team. It's not just one side or the other.
Yeah, definitely. I agree.
Interesting. I have one more category of things to talk about, and and I think we can spend another episode on all these different things, sort of picking apart all the details. But how would you look at the return on investment of outsourcing different functions in a practice? An example is outsourcing billing. Like, how would you think about, should I outsource, and what might that do to my practice? How would you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that goes back to, if you look at billing specifically, that goes back to, am I spreading my staff too thin? So I think looking at the cost of, looking at what you're bringing in. So that would be an amount of money you can quantify, how much that you're getting in from billing insurance. And obviously thinking about the fact that, an insurance billing company is probably going to find some things that your, office manager that really is only a billing and coding because they learned it at your office versus, professionally knows how to do that. But yeah, breaking even on that, making sure that monthly the revenue that they're bringing in is substantially higher than what you're paying them. But you could be paying a staff member, $15 to $20 an hour, and they could be spending their time. It's a lot of data entry. It's a lot of time spent for, sometimes unfortunately not as much money as you should be getting. That's a different conversation. But yeah, so looking at how much revenue they're bringing, thinking about the fact that they're probably finding things that your staff wouldn't, and finding ways to utilize your staff in office. There's so many things that you can outsource now. Obviously, bookkeeping is one of them. Thinking about how you can utilize staff in office to create that overall patient experience, because it's become really technical. Technology has kind of taken over that experience. There's offices that don't even have doctors in them. Making sure that your office is set apart by having that fully present staff member, not focusing on billing. If you're low insurance practice, obviously, then that's a little bit different. But yeah, I think that if you have a high amount of insurance coming into your office, it's definitely worth outsourcing and looking around, talking to associates and colleagues and saying, who do you use? Do you find them efficient? Kind of thing.
I guess that's a good point to wrap up, because we've talked about a lot of different things. We've talked about calculating rate of return, both through breaking even, how many months or years is it going to take to start to break even, to bring in enough revenue that it's covering the extra expenses you're adding on from that investment. We talked about calculating a literal return on investment, either per year or over the useful lifespan of a piece of equipment, things like that. We've talked about staff, optometrists. We talked about a whole lot here. What final thoughts do you have for the listener in terms of just thinking about, okay, what should I invest next in my practice?
Yeah. Final thoughts. I think that the world is coming back to normal, and that's a really good time for us to look overall at where we can spend our money. I see a lot of doctors sitting on top of so much cash that they could be using in other ways. So, knowing your numbers, knowing how much is just sitting in the bank doing nothing for you, but also avoiding that shiny object syndrome and stretching yourself thin financially. But, having the knowledge of where you stand and have a goal of where you want to be is really important. But once again, it always goes back to taking yourself out sometimes, removing yourself from that exam room and just kind of evaluating and looking over your practice as a whole, because it's a complicated business in terms of it is medical, but it is retail, but it is, there's a whole bunch of, there's technology involved, there's multifacets in the industry. And so you want to make sure that you're touching base with all of those. If that's your goal to grow, if you want to stay the same, you do the same. If you want to do, your manual phoropter and that's what your patient base is, and that makes you happy, stay with that. Don't do something just because everyone else is doing it, but make sure you're checking in with your goals and that your numbers align with said goals.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate that. Yeah. Check in with your own business goals, know your numbers, make sure they're accurate, and check in with your professionals, talk with the people around you, talk with the team you built around you, and make sure that you're making the best decisions that you can. Well, I really appreciate it, Amanda. This was a lot of fun. And where can people find you, follow you, learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate you having me on. You can find me on LinkedIn, like you said. I'm on there a lot. You can find me on my website. It's just Bookkeeping for Optometry. When I thought of a name for my business, I was like, I can literally name it what I do and for who I do it for. So yeah, everything's Bookkeeping for Optometry, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram even, and my website. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, for the listener, thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you on the next episode. Take care.
Want more resources to help master your money? Check out the Education Hub on Evon's website at optometrywealth.com. Evon Mendrin is a certified financial planner and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors, a California registered investment advisor. All opinions of Evon and his guests are their own. This show is for informational purposes only and should not be relied on for specific investment, legal, tax, or other decisions. Clients of OWA may own securities mentioned on this show.